something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop. Children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
1968 was an unusual time to be alive and a good time to be angry. The Vietnam War was getting more attention and more hate. Although civil rights laws had recently been passed, leaders Robert F. Kennedy and Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. had recently been assassinated, and frustration was growing nationwide. In all the commotion, there was a presidential election going on. The changes that came from the 1968 Democratic National Convention were fueled by violence between the police and protesters, Mayor Richard J. Daley aggressing the protesters, and the bias in the media. As the war was getting more and more unpopular, many young people decided to protest. One of the biggest anti-war groups was the Youth International Party, Yippies for short, led by activists Jerry Rubin and Abbie Hoffman. The Yippies were especially against the war, but the only candidates sure to be nominated favored keeping the troops in Vietnam. After an unpopular presidency, Lyndon B. Johnson had decided not to run again. This opened the door for other presidential candidates, and his VP, Hubert Humphrey, joined the race. He was battling it out with Senator Eugene McCarthy, the other major candidate. Both supported the Vietnam War. They were well favored by other people in the party. These people were called party bosses, and at the time, they chose who would represent their party in the national election. That all changed after the 1968 Democratic National Convention. The Yippies were frustrated that they couldn't directly elect a candidate with a similar point of view on the war as they had. There were protests and Yippie conventions all around the country, but they were never televised on a national scale. But they needed attention and a good place to gather. Chicago was perfect. The anti-war campaigners saw the convention as an opportunity to publicize their point of view. So the call went out, and all the anti-war parties from all over the country came in large numbers to protest. The anti-war parties would finally get their chance at the convention. Mayor Richard J. Daley was given the task of keeping the convention in check. President Lyndon B. Johnson gave him that responsibility, and in order to please the president, Mayor Daley wasn't going to allow any disruption. He denied all march permits beforehand and made plans to enforce curfew laws at the city parks, hoping to discourage the Yippies from protesting. This didn't change anything, and the Yippies still came to protest. Protesters gathered and set up in Lincoln Park.
My friend is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind.
The park was about 7 miles away from the International Amphitheater, where the convention was held. They didn't have any permit to stay after 11 o'clock, the park's closing time, so those who camped out were technically about to break the law. They didn't think much of it, as that law wasn't highly enforced. They felt safe. The Yippies ridiculed the candidates and even nominated a pig to be president. They poked fun at the Democratic Party, while complaining about Vietnam and the party's ignorance. The mood was festive. Meanwhile, the police and the National Guard awaited Mayor Daley's command. Mayor Daley needed the convention to go smoothly, or he would disappoint his colleagues. At 11 o'clock, after the park closed, Mayor Daley gave the signal and sent the police to disperse the crowds. There are many first-hand accounts, and according to the Yippies, the police attacked them that night. The police say they were doing their job and that Yippies were being violent. The Yippies taunted them endlessly. The most popular chant was, "The whole world is watching," in reference to a large amount of cameras.
Before you can hear people cry,
They threw trash at the police and screamed profanities at them. This provoked the policemen and some went out of control. Mayor Daley had hoped the media would focus on the convention instead of the protests happening outside. But just the opposite happened. Police sprayed the Yippies with mace and tear gas, hit them with nightsticks and batons, and would occasionally threaten them with guns. There had to be a neurosurgeon on duty at the nearest hospital all night. Drawn into the pandemonium themselves, the media mostly focused on the beatings and assaults by the police. The media labeled these events as riots by the police. In an interview, Wayne Heimbach, a witness to the events in Chicago, said that the police did what they were told and didn't start riots. In fact, he said, quote, "The police were quite effective in moving information to force protesters from different sections of the neighborhood into smaller and more controllable areas. Riots imply that they were somehow out of control. Generally, that was not true," unquote. He says that the protesters attempted to make the convention look so bad it would spark a nationwide discussion on the war and how candidates get nominated for president. It worked, and many of the news channels reported on the violence and brutal tactics of the police.
Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do.
The day after these so-called riots, Mayor Daley made an official statement about his police force, claiming that they were for the most part orderly and that the entire police force shouldn't be blamed for the alleged actions of a few policemen who had acted inappropriately. Mayor Daley claimed that some of the protesters had planned even worse things, and that's why he sent out his police force to round them up. He even labeled these protesters terrorists, saying, quote, "The intention of these terrorists was openly displayed. They repeatedly stated that they came to Chicago to disrupt the National Political Convention and to paralyze the city," unquote. After the convention, there was a discussion about the war at every meeting within the Democratic and Republican parties and at every dinner table across America. And although the removal of troops from Vietnam was probably inevitable, the Yippies made it unavoidable. The Yippies indirectly changed the presidential nominating process as well. While it wasn't intentional, it was the biggest change they made. The party was left dazed and confused. The party couldn't properly get behind their nominee, Hubert Humphrey, as he was unpopular among voters. The protesters had exposed how undemocratic the existing nomination system really was. So, Senator George McGovern and Representative Donald M. Frazier created a commission called the McGovern-Frazier Commission. The results of their work created a new system that allowed people to decide who they wanted to represent their party. Before this event, candidates were chosen by party bosses, and nowadays we have the caucus to have voters' voices heard and ask the candidates questions. Party delegates still decide who will represent the party, but now the system is based on popular vote and opinion. In a way, if Mayor Daley and the police hadn't been so violent towards the protesters, maybe we would never have the modern-day caucus. Mayor Daley and the police inadvertently brought attention to the issue. Until then, the country had not questioned the presidential nominating system. It's also very similar to the civil rights movement. White supremacists beat black activists, and that brought more attention and sympathy to their cause. This encouraged more and more people to join them and fight against discrimination. History shows us that protesting can be effective, but the resistance to the protest often brings a change. You need opposition to take a stand. While the violence at the 1968 Democratic National Convention was terrible, it sparked important changes. The mayor created the necessary opposition through his threats and aggressive handling of protesters. The media broadcast reinforced the negatives. These factors all helped get the troops out of Vietnam and change the primary election in the United States.